looking at ownership, there's a lot of different ways, there's a lot of different types of conversations you want to have here. It kind of starts with, what does ownership look like in our family business? And again, there's no right or wrong answer. The right answer is what works for your family and your business. But what will ownership look like? What's our new reality as we shift from one generation down to the next? Things are going to change. The ownership agreements change. The number of owners could change. Who gets ownership can change. So we've got to make sure that this new reality is really clearly discussed and agreed upon. And then understanding what components of ownership are going to change. So when we look at succession, we want to first start with, what are our even options? How do we transition the business? How do we transition ownership? Whom does it get transitioned to? And then how does it get transitioned? Is it sold? Is it gifted? What are the different ways that we would pass ownership down to that next generation? In terms of who gets ownership, it's really important here to talk about, who are our partners going to be? You know, we can't choose our siblings. We are born into a family, like it or not. But we can choose our partners, and we can really be thoughtful about it. And a question that, although difficult to ask yourself and to ask others, is that if I were to start this business from scratch, would I choose my sibling as a partner? And it's an important question to think about. Doesn't mean you have to say yes or no definitively, but I encourage you to think about, what will my partner relationship look like with my brother or my sister? And this starts to get into the different concepts of wearing hats. What hat am I wearing when I make a decision? Am I a brother? Am I talking to my sister? Am I talking to my aunt or my uncle? Or am I a business person and I'm an owner and I'm a shareholder and I'm expecting to have certain results in the business because I own a piece of this company? And you've got to be able to separate those different discussions depending on what type of a discussion you're having relative to the business. Thinking like an owner is really understanding, that's the ownership hat. And I'm looking to drive the business. I'm looking to drive profitability. I want to be able to reinvest in the organization. Does that mean I don't take dividends this year because I have a huge CapEx expense that I have to reinvest in? You've got to be able to think like an owner. And a lot of that, the best word that comes to mind that I think about is the concept of stewardship. Really stewarding this company for your generation and maybe even generations to come. And how do I continue to drive the business and then allow the business to help take care of the family? So there's an old family business adage in the industry that says, if the family takes care of the business will take care of the family. And we've got to be able to ask ourselves that and have a conversation, and ideally build alignment as to what are the goals of this family enterprise. What's our vision? What's our commitment to the business? What's our expectations of the business back to us as shareholders? And really thinking about that. The next concept to think about is, who should be an owner? And this is where family and ownership can get a little fuzzy here, because in family, generally it's fair is equal. If there's 3 kids at the dinner table and there's dessert and there's 3 cookies, each kid gets a cookie. Well, in this case, each kid may not get a cookie, i.e. in the family business. It's not necessarily the right thing for the company. That's what's fair at the dinner table. The question is, what's fair in the organization? So really understanding who should get ownership. I'm working with a client now. There's 3 siblings who work in the business and 2 who don't work in the business. Is it fair for the 2 that don't work in the business to get equal ownership and voting and control with respect to the 3 that do work in the business? I don't know. That family's going to have to figure it out for themselves. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. Typically, we would encourage that those who work in the business drive the business, make the business decisions. I own stock in Nike, but I can't tell Phil Knight and the CEO and the owners of Nike what to do. I just get the privilege of owning a really cool stock. Sometimes you got to think of the same way in a family business. Do you own it, or do you actually control it? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The other piece is, what's driving the transition? What's the timing? Is this about estate planning, or mom and dad getting a little bit older and it's actually time to start to transition ownership? Or right now in our economy and in where we are in our government, there's some tax incentives to actually start to transition the business. But I always encourage us, don't let the tax tail wag the dog. Make sure we're making good decisions as to what's best for the business with respect to timing. Don't just let taxes and the finances drive the decision. Make sure the timing is right. Then you move into control. Who has the control? We often encourage you to separate equity shares from voting shares, Class A versus Class B. Class A shares are the controlling shares of an organization. They vote the board. They vote for distributions, reinvestment. They decide what business we're even in as owners. Equity shares get to enjoy the fruits of the labor, so to speak. It's the financial aspects. That's where wealth is often created in a family business. So deciding who gets voting shares versus who gets equity shares is an important and very, very difficult at times discussion to have, but it's critical. And have it before it's time to do it. These are the kinds of conversations, all of these conversations that Nicole and I have been talking about this whole webinar. Have these conversations early and often, not at the time of the event. Finally, one of the things you want to look at is, what type of an owner are you? There's generally 6 kinds of owners in a family enterprise. There's the operating owner, who's the individual who's employed, and they're involved in the day-to-day operations of the business. There's the governing owner, who's a full-time overseer of the business, but they're not involved in the day-to-day operations. That may be a board member, for example, as a governing owner. You have the involved owner. They're not employed, but they're genuinely interested in the business and attentive to all the issues with respect to the organization. The passive owner is somebody who maybe they collect dividends. They're generally not interested in the business. They're lucky to be part of that family, as an example, and they don't really make a conscious decision to remain an owner. They just kind of go with the flow, so to speak. An investor owner is somebody who collects dividends, but they are interested in the success of the business, and they make active decisions to remain an owner, and they want to stay involved. They want to be part of the decision making, maybe help contribute to building a board, as an example. And finally, you have the proud owner. They're not engaged in the day-to-day business, but they're certainly proud to be an owner. So the question is, what type of an owner are you? And again, there's no right or wrong answer here. The right answer is what feels right to you. So be authentic to yourself, but talk about it with your family and understand, saying you appreciate the opportunity to be an owner here, but you really don't want to get involved in the business. That's a great answer because it helps set the expectations as to what your role is in the family business going forward.
And I just want to reiterate what David is saying about there not being a right or wrong answer, because a lot of times as we're moving into the sibling generation, the operating owners and even governing owners can get very frustrated with the investor owners and proud owners, that they may think their engagement is due to lack of interest or they just don't care. So that's where we need to be really, really clear about the fact that it is okay that not everybody is an operating owner. I worked with a family earlier this month that there's 8 siblings and there just isn't space in the business for 8 owners or 8 operator owners. So we had a family meeting, and so there's elements of all 6 of these types of owners within this family. And it took some facilitation and it took some time to get to that understanding that it's okay to not have everybody working in the business, that you may not want everybody working in the business. That's a lot of stress on relationships and a lot of stress on the business itself. So coming to an understanding that these different motivations and these different priorities, they're okay. We just need to manage, again, those expectations and the communication we have around these different types of owners so it doesn't breed frustration and it doesn't breed that resentment.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point, Nicole. Thank you. And then on to the next slide. This comes down to with respect to ownership, we have to be able to make decisions in the business, but we want to know what levels of decisions, who makes what in the organization. So there's kind of 3 main governance structures here that I'll talk about: ownership, board, and management. And owners are responsible for certain levels of decisions. The board is responsible if you have one in place, and then ideally management is also responsible. So as an example, owners, they set the ownership succession. How do we pass the business down to the next generation and to whom? What's the board, what's the board composition look like? We want to elect the board and we set the compensation for the board as well. What are the company's mission, vision, values around the organization? And what even business are you in? That's up to the owners to set that vision. Also, family policy may be one that we would encourage is established in the family business, and often it's spoken and talked about at the ownership level. The board may be responsible for things like senior management succession. Who is the next CEO? And tasking the board with that responsibility. Looking at dividends and distributions, measuring the weight of, I have to reinvest in the organization versus it would be nice to be able to issue a distribution to the family. What's our strategy? And ensuring that management is executing on the strategy that is set. CEO appointment I talked about, and then also business performance and ensuring that the business is hitting the benchmarks and the goals that are being established and managing up to the ownership group with whom the board reports. And then finally, looking at management, you want to look at company culture and you want to look at the day-to-day operations. Their responsibility is to the board's responsibility is to the ownership group.
One thing I like to use this tool for as we're going from, because I work with a lot of G1s to G2 transitions. So a lot of times what I like to do is have the first generation or the current leaders or owners map this out how things are today. Because a lot of times a board may not exist or a board isn't functioning to this level. So a lot of times it's one column that one person is doing this whole list of things. So then as our ownership group changes, we can have an evolving matrix like this. So even though today it may all be heavy in one column, what is going to have to change as we bring in new owners? Maybe we map out a board, maybe our management team is with outside of the family. So we can have different versions or iterations of this spreadsheet, of this matrix, as that ownership circle changes.
That's a great point. I'll actually give you another case. I'm working with a 7th generation family business that has 35 different owners, clearly not at the sibling level, but they're down in the cousins. They've had a formal board in place for over 20 years, very successful business. As a family grows to that level, they start to get into family governance as well, a family assembly, a family council. So what we did is we took this and we put it on steroids, basically, and created, I don't know, I think there's got to be 35 or 40 line items. And we have family assembly, family council, owners, board, and management across the top, and who makes what decisions at all of those levels. This is a 7th generation business. It's been wildly successful for over 100 years, yet they still wanted us to go back and dust this off and look at it this summer. And so it's a constant evolving, family businesses are a constant evolving piece. It's never set in stone.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's true of all the tools that we've given today, that this isn't a one-time deal, saved in a spreadsheet, throw it in a drawer. This will change as your business changes.
Yeah, no question. A very, very valuable tool.